She gets nothing. Marcus's voice cut through the church like a blade, sharp and final. The mourners hadn't even left yet. Dad's casket was still being loaded into the hearse, and my brother was already dividing up an empire like he was carving a turkey. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I stood frozen in my black dress, watching his lips move as he spoke to the lawyer. Mr. Whitman nodded, his weathered face grave but unsurprised. Around us, relatives shuffled past in their funeral clothes, whispering condolences and casting sideways glances at the Thornton family drama unfolding in real time. "Everything goes to me," Marcus continued, his voice carrying that same authoritative tone he'd used since we were kids. "The business, the properties, the accounts. All of it. She's never shown any interest in Dad's work anyway." That's when I smiled. Not a big smile, nothing dramatic. Just a small, knowing curve of my lips that made Marcus pause mid-sentence. He turned to look at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Something funny, Marjorie?" "Not funny," I said quietly, "just interesting timing." Mr. Whitman cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should discuss this at the office tomorrow. Today is for family," Marcus interrupted. "And the family takes care of business." Dad always said that. He was right, Dad had always said that. What Marcus didn't know was that Dad had said a lot of other things too. Things my brother never bothered to stick around and hear. The funeral home was stuffy, filled with the scent of lilies and old wood. I watched as Marcus worked the room like he was campaigning for office, shaking hands, accepting condolences, playing the part of the grieving eldest son who was stepping up to carry on the family legacy. Thomas Thornton had built Thornton Construction from nothing. Started with a pickup truck and a toolbox in 1978, turned it into the biggest commercial construction company in 3 counties. 57 buildings bore his signature, from the downtown courthouse to the new hospital wing. He was the kind of man who measured success in concrete poured and steel erected. Marcus had joined the company straight out of college, took his MBA and his father's expectations, and ran with them. He was good at the business side, I'll give him that. Could read a profit margin like scripture and negotiate a contract like a diplomat. But he never got his hands dirty. Never learned the weight of a hammer or the satisfaction of building something from the ground up. I had. Every summer from age 12 to 18, I begged Dad to let me come to the job sites. While Marcus was at tennis camp or debate team, I was learning how to read blueprints, how to spot a structural weakness, how to manage crews who'd been pouring concrete since before I was born. Dad used to joke that I had sawdust in my veins instead of blood. "You sure you don't want to study engineering?" he asked me in my senior year of high school. I could use someone in the family who really understands the work. But I had other plans: art school, photography. A life that didn't revolve around construction schedules and zoning permits. I thought I was choosing freedom. What I'd actually chosen was distance. The distance grew wider after Mom died. Marcus stepped into her role as Dad's confidant, his right hand, his heir apparent. I became the daughter who called on holidays and sent birthday cards. The one who lived in Portland, chasing artistic dreams while the real world of family business carried on without her. Or so everyone thought. Marcus was still talking to Mr. Whitman, his gestures becoming more animated as he outlined his vision for the company's future. I caught fragments of his conversation: expansion plans, new markets, modernization, all the things Dad had been resistant to in his final years. "The old man was stuck in his ways," Marcus was saying, "but I've got ideas, real ideas. We could double our revenue in 5 years if we play this right." Mr. Whitman's expression remained neutral, but I saw his eyes flick toward me, brief, knowing, like he was remembering something Marcus had forgotten. The viewing was yesterday, open casket, Dad looking smaller than I remembered, his big construction worker's hands folded peacefully over his chest. Marcus had stood at the head of the casket, accepting condolences like he was receiving tribute. I'd stood to the side, the quiet daughter, the one who'd moved away and made a life for herself elsewhere. But I'd also been the one who'd flown back every other month for the past 2 years, the one who'd sat in doctor's offices and held Dad's hand through chemotherapy. The one who'd learned to make his morning coffee exactly the way he liked it. 2 sugars, splash of cream, stirred counterclockwise. Marcus had been busy, always busy. Important meetings, crucial deals, the kind of work that couldn't be interrupted for medical appointments or family dinners. He'd visit when he could, usually on Sundays, usually for an hour or two before his phone would ring with some emergency that required his immediate attention. Business doesn't stop for illness, he'd told me once. Dad understands that. He'd want me to keep things running. And Dad had nodded, the way he always did when Marcus spoke. But after my brother left, Dad would sit quietly in his chair, staring out the window at the oak tree in the backyard, the one where he'd built us a treehouse when we were kids. "Remember when you fell out of that tree?" he'd asked me one afternoon in February. "Broke your arm in 2 places." "I remember Marcus daring me to climb higher," I'd said. "And I remember you doing it anyway." Dad's laugh had turned into a cough. You never could back down from a challenge. The memory made me smile now, standing in the funeral home watching Marcus orchestrate what he thought was his coronation. He'd always been the one with the plans, the vision, the certainty about how things should be. But he'd also always been the one who left the actual work to other people. Mrs. Patterson from Dad's church approached me, her elderly hands shaking as she reached for mine. "Your father was such a good man," she said. "He talked about you all the time at coffee hour. So proud of your photography work." "Thank you," I said, squeezing her hands gently. "He showed us the article about your gallery showing, the one in that fancy magazine. Said you were making a name for yourself." I nodded, surprised. Dad had never mentioned seeing the article. It was a small piece in a regional arts publication, nothing major, but he'd kept track. "He always said you got his eye for detail," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Said you could see things other people missed." Marcus's voice rose slightly behind me. "I don't see why we need to wait until tomorrow. The will is straightforward. Dad and I went over it multiple times. Everything's been arranged." Mr. Whitman's response was too quiet for me to hear, but I saw Marcus's jaw tighten. Then the lawyer's eyes found mine across the room again, and this time he held my gaze for just a moment longer than necessary. The funeral procession to the cemetery was a long line of black cars winding through downtown Springfield. Dad had picked his plot years ago, right next to Mom's headstone with a view of the river where he used to take us fishing. The service was brief, simple, the way he would have wanted it. Marcus stood at the graveside with his wife Caroline and their 2 kids, looking every inch the successful businessman even in grief. His suit was perfectly tailored, his expression appropriately solemn. When it came time to throw dirt on the casket, he did it with the same controlled precision he brought to everything else. I stood on the opposite side of the grave, alone, no husband, no children, just me and a handful of Dad's friends from the construction crews. Men with weathered hands and honest faces who'd worked for Thomas Thornton for decades. "Hell of a man," one of them said to me afterward. "Taught me everything I know about concrete work. Always said you were smart as a whip." "Smart enough to get out," another added with a grin. "Always said you were the one with sense." They drifted away one by one, back to their trucks and their own lives. Soon it was just the family and Mr. Whitman standing around the grave as the cemetery workers prepared to fill it in. "Tomorrow," Marcus said to the lawyer. 10 o'clock, we'll get this sorted out." "Tomorrow," Mr. Whitman agreed, but he was looking at me when he said it. Caroline tugged at Marcus's sleeve. "The kids need to get home. This has been a long day for them." Marcus nodded, then turned to me. "You should come to the office too. There might be some personal items Dad wanted you to have. Photos, jewelry, that sort of thing." "Personal items," I repeated. "Nothing major, just, sentimental stuff." I nodded slowly. "I'll be there." As they walked away, I heard Marcus talking to Caroline in the parking lot. His voice carried in the still air. "It's better this way," he was saying. "She's got her own life in Portland. What would she do with a construction company? She doesn't know the first thing about running a business." Caroline's response was too quiet to hear, but Marcus laughed. "Trust me, Dad was practical above all else. He knew what he was doing." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. I stood there alone as the sun set behind the hills, watching the workers fill in Dad's grave. The dirt made a hollow sound as it hit the casket, final and irreversible. In the distance, I could see the Springfield skyline, dotted with buildings that bore Dad's signature. The courthouse where he'd fought his first zoning battle, the shopping center that had established his reputation, the hospital where he'd spent his final weeks. 57 buildings, a lifetime of work, a legacy built one brick at a time. My phone buzzed. A text from my assistant in Portland. Gallery wants to extend your show another 2 weeks. They're calling it a breakthrough success. I smiled and typed back. Tell them I'll be away for a while. Family business. The cemetery was empty now, except for me and the maintenance crew. I knelt by the fresh grave and placed a single white rose on the mound of dirt. See you tomorrow, Dad, I whispered. Then I walked to my rental car and drove back to the hotel, where I had some phone calls to make. Important calls. The kind that would change everything. Marcus thought he knew what Dad wanted. He thought he understood how Thomas Thornton's mind worked, how he'd weighed his options and made his choices. He thought he knew what was in that will. But Marcus had been busy. Too busy to sit in those doctor's offices, too busy to help Dad organize his papers, too busy to be there when Dad made his final decisions. I hadn't been busy. I'd been present, I'd been listening, and I'd been learning things about Dad's business that would surprise my brother quite a bit. The hotel room was small but clean, with a view of the downtown area where Dad had built his first commercial project. I ordered room service and spread out the contents of my purse on the bed. Business cards, phone numbers, copies of documents I'd been collecting for months. My phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I'd been expecting. Marjorie? This is David Chen. You asked me to call after the funeral. Thank you for calling, David. Are you available to meet tomorrow morning, before reading? Of course. 9 o'clock work for you? Perfect. Bring everything we discussed. Everything's ready. This is going to be quite a surprise. I hung up and looked out the window at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Marcus was probably having dinner with Caroline, planning his future as the head of Thornton Construction. Probably making lists of changes he wanted to implement, people he wanted to hire, directions he wanted to take the company. He'd always been good at making plans, but he'd never been good at paying attention to what was actually happening while he was making them. The room service arrived, a simple dinner that reminded me of the meals I'd shared with Dad during his final months. We'd eaten a lot of dinners together, just the two of us, talking about everything and nothing. About Mom, about the old days, about the business he'd built from scratch. One who understands that the foundation is the most important part. I closed the notebook and set it on the nightstand. Tomorrow Marcus would learn what Dad had really thought about foundations, and about who he trusted to build them. The funeral was over. The real work was just beginning. The meeting with David Chen took place at a small diner on the outskirts of Springfield, far from the downtown office buildings where Marcus conducted his business. David looked younger than his 42 years, with intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of calm demeanor that came from handling complicated situations for a living. Your father was quite something, David said, sliding a manila envelope across the Formica table. In 30 years of practicing law, I've never had a client quite like him. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside were documents I'd helped Dad prepare over the past 8 months, each one bearing his careful signature and yesterday's date. Well, technically yesterday's date. In reality, these papers had been signed weeks ago, but Dad had been very specific about the timing. He really thought of everything, I said, scanning the pages. He did. Said you were the only one who'd understand what needed to be done. David stirred sugar into his coffee. He also said Marcus wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. The plan had started forming last Christmas. I'd flown back for the holidays, expecting the usual family dinner, where Marcus dominated the conversation with business updates, while Caroline managed the children, and I played the role of the distant daughter who'd chosen art over ambition. But Dad had pulled me aside after dinner. His voice was weaker than I remembered, the chemotherapy taking its toll, but his mind was sharp as ever. I need to show you something, he'd said, leading me to his study. The room was exactly as I remembered from childhood. Wood-paneled walls covered with framed photos of construction projects, awards from the Chamber of Commerce, certificates of completion for buildings that had shaped the city's skyline. But there were new additions too, printouts of my photography website, a framed copy of that magazine article Mrs. Patterson had mentioned, newspaper clippings about gallery showings I didn't even know he'd been tracking. "You've been busy," he'd said, settling into his leather chair with a grunt of pain. "So have you, apparently." I'd picked up one of the articles. "You kept all of this?" "I keep track of what matters." He'd pulled out a thick folder from his desk drawer. "Just like I keep track of what's happening with the business." That folder had changed everything. Inside were financial records going back 5 years, documenting a pattern I'd never suspected. Marcus hadn't just been running Thornton Construction, he'd been systematically weakening it. The numbers told a story Dad had been watching unfold for years. Contracts bid too low to secure work, then bleeding money when costs inevitably ran over. Key employees leaving for competitors after being passed over for promotions in favor of Marcus's MBA friends who'd never swung a hammer. Equipment purchases that looked good on paper but performed poorly in the field. "Is he doing this on purpose?" I'd asked, struggling to understand the scope of what I was seeing. "I don't think so." Dad's voice was tired. "I think he's just in over his head, trying to modernize too fast. Make changes without understanding why things worked the way they did in the first place." The worst part wasn't the financial losses, though those were substantial. It was reputation damage. Thornton Construction had built its name on reliability, on projects completed on time and under budget. Under Marcus's leadership, deadlines were missed, quality was inconsistent, and longtime clients were starting to look elsewhere. "The Riverside Medical Center project," Dad had said, pointing to a particular set of documents, "that was supposed to be our signature work for this decade. Marcus underbid it by 30%, then tried to make up the difference by cutting corners on materials." I'd looked at the inspection reports, the change orders, the angry letters from the hospital board. What should have been a showcase had become a cautionary tale. "Why haven't you stepped in?" I'd asked. Because I wanted to see if he'd figure it out on his own, if he'd ask for help, if he'd admit he'd made mistakes. Dad had leaned back in his chair. "But Marcus doesn't make mistakes. Ask him, he'll tell you." That Christmas conversation had planted the seed. Over the next few months, as I'd flown back to help with Dad's medical appointments, we'd talked more about the business. Not just the problems, but the potential solutions. The contracts that were still profitable, the employees who still believed in the company's mission, the opportunities Marcus was missing because he was too focused on chasing the next big deal. "What would you do differently?" Dad had asked me one afternoon in March. It was a hypothetical question, or so I'd thought. But I'd found myself answering seriously, drawing on everything I'd learned during those childhood summers on construction sites. The way crews worked best, when they felt valued. The importance of understanding a project from foundation to finish. The relationships with suppliers and subcontractors that took years to build and could be destroyed by a single broken promise. "You'd go back to basics," I'd said. "Focus on what we do well instead of trying to be everything to everyone." "We?" I caught the pronoun too late. "I mean what the company does well." Dad had smiled. "Is that what you mean?" Now, sitting in the diner with David Chen, I understood that those conversations hadn't been hypothetical at all. They had been interviewed. Job interviews, in a way, though I hadn't realized it at the time. "He recorded some of your conversations," David said quietly. "With your permission, of course. He wanted to make sure there was documentation of your understanding of the business operations." "Recorded them?" "Audio only. He said you'd given him permission to do that for his own reference, to help him remember the details later." David pulled out a small digital recorder. "Is that correct?" I thought back to those afternoons. Dad had often had trouble remembering things between the pain medication and the chemotherapy fog. I'd suggested he record our conversation so he could reference them later if he needed to. I thought he meant for medical information, appointment schedules, that sort of thing. "Yes," I said. "I gave permission." "Good, because some of those recordings demonstrate a level of business knowledge that might surprise people." The recordings weren't the only surprise Dad had prepared. Over the past 6 months, he'd been conducting his own investigation into the company's finances. Not the official books Marcus presented at board meetings, but a deeper analysis of where the money was actually going. Your brother has been paying himself a salary that's 3 times industry standard, David said, showing me a compensation analysis, plus bonuses tied to contracts signed, not contracts completed profitably. So he's incentivized to bid low and sign fast. Exactly. And when the projects lose money, the company absorbs the loss, while Marcus still gets paid for the initial signature. It was worse than I'd imagined. Marcus wasn't just making bad decisions. He was making profitable bad decisions. For himself, anyway. The board doesn't know about this? The board consists of your father, your brother, and Caroline. Your father has been too sick to attend meetings regularly, and Caroline generally defers to Marcus on business matters. So Marcus has been running the company with essentially no oversight. For the past 2 years, yes. David spread out more documents on the table. Bank statements, vendor contracts, employee records. The full scope of what Dad had been quietly documenting while Marcus thought he was safely in control. There's more, David said. Your brother has been in negotiations to sell the company to Meridian Construction. The offer is substantially below market value, but it includes a significant management contract for Marcus personally. I stared at the preliminary purchase agreement. Marcus's signature was already on it, pending board approval. He'd been planning to sell Dad's life work and walk away with a golden parachute. Dad knew about this? He found out 3 weeks ago. That's when he called me to finalize his arrangements. The arrangements. The real reason we were meeting this morning. Dad hadn't just been collecting evidence of Marcus's mismanagement. He'd been preparing to do something about it. The will Marcus is expecting to hear today, I said slowly. That's not the real will, is it? David smiled. Your father filed an updated will with my office 6 weeks ago. The previous version, the one Marcus has a copy of, was superseded. Legally superseded. And Marcus doesn't know. Your father was very specific about that. He wanted today to be educational. I thought about Marcus at the funeral yesterday, so confident in his assumptions about what Dad had planned. So certain that he understood how his father's mind worked. What exactly is in the new will? David pulled out a sealed envelope. Your father wanted you to read it first, before the official reading. He said you'd need time to prepare for what comes next. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. The document was brief but comprehensive. Thomas Thornton had left his house and personal effects to be split between his children. But the business, all of it, the company, the properties, the contracts, the equipment, went to me. Not just ownership, control, voting rights. The authority to make decisions about the company's future. There are conditions, David explained. You have to actively manage the company for a minimum of 2 years. You can't sell it during that time without board approval, and the board now includes 3 new members your father appointed. Who? Jim Martinez, who's been the foreman on your biggest projects for 20 years. Susan Walsh from accounting, who's been tracking the financial irregularities Marcus doesn't know she's been tracking. And me, as the legal representative. A board that wouldn't automatically defer to Marcus, a board that understood the difference between signing contracts and completing them profitably. Your father also left detailed recommendations for company operations, David continued. Suggestions for reversing the damage of the past 2 years. A plan for getting back to profitability. Based on our conversations. Based on your conversations, yes. He was very impressed with your understanding of the operational challenges. I sat back in the vinyl booth, trying to process the enormity of what Dad had done. He hadn't just given me a construction company. He'd given me a mission. A chance to save what Marcus had been slowly destroying. Marcus is going to fight this, I said. Probably. But your father anticipated that too. David pulled out another folder. Documentation of the financial mismanagement, the unauthorized salary increases, the preliminary sale negotiations Marcus never disclosed to the board, plus those recordings of your conversations demonstrating your competency to run the business. A full case for why the inheritance is justified. More than justified, necessary. I looked at my watch. We had 30 minutes before the official will reading at Mr. Whitman's office. 30 minutes before Marcus learned that his assumptions about his inheritance were completely wrong. Are you ready for this? David asked. I thought about the past 8 months. The flights back and forth from Portland. The afternoon sitting with Dad, thinking I was just being a good daughter, while he was actually preparing me for something much bigger. The way he'd listened to my ideas about the business, encouraging me to think beyond the role of distant observer. I don't know, I said honestly, but I think that's what Dad was counting on. What do you mean? Marcus would say he's ready, he'd have a 5-year plan and a PowerPoint presentation, but he'd be ready for the wrong thing. I gathered up the documents. Dad wanted someone who'd ask the right questions, instead of having all the wrong answers. David smiled. He said you'd say something like that. We finished our coffee and prepared to drive to the law office where Marcus was waiting. I had 15 minutes to transform from the quiet daughter who'd chosen art over business into the new owner of Thornton Construction. It felt impossible. It felt terrifying. It felt exactly like the kind of challenge Dad would have expected me to rise to meet. One more thing, David said as we reached our cars. Your father left you a personal note. He said to give it to you right before the reading. The note was written in Dad's careful handwriting on company letterhead. Marjorie, you learned to see the whole building before you laid the first brick. That's what makes you ready. Trust yourself. Build something that lasts. Dad. I folded the note and put it in my purse next to the other documents that would change everything. Then I drove toward downtown Springfield, toward the law office, where my brother was waiting to inherit an empire that was no longer his to claim. The real work was about to begin. Mr. Whitman's law office occupied the 3rd floor of a historic brick building that Dad had actually renovated back in 1983. The irony wasn't lost on me as I rode the elevator up, running my fingers along the brass handrail that had been installed by Thornton construction crews decades ago. Marcus was already there when I arrived, sitting in the conference room like he owned the place. He'd changed from his funeral suit into a charcoal business suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Caroline sat beside him checking her phone, while their lawyer, someone I didn't recognize, shuffled through papers with the focused intensity of a man billing by the hour. Marjorie, Marcus stood as I entered, glad you could make it, this shouldn't take long. I took a seat across the polished oak table. I have time. Good, good. Marcus settled back into his chair. I know this might be emotional for you, but I want you to know I'll take care of everything. Dad's affairs, the business transitions, all of it. You won't have to worry about any of the complicated stuff. Mr. Whitman entered the room carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. He nodded to everyone present and took his place at the head of the table. Before we begin, he said, I need to inform everyone that there have been some recent developments regarding Mr. Thornton's estate planning. Marcus frowned. What kind of developments? Mr. Thornton filed an updated will with this office 6 weeks ago. The document you have a copy of, Marcus, has been legally superseded. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus's lawyer leaned forward, his pen poised over a legal pad. Superseded how? Marcus asked, his voice tight. A new will was executed, properly witnessed and notarized, reflecting Mr. Thornton's final wishes regarding the disposition of his assets. Caroline looked up from her phone for the first time. What does that mean exactly? It means, Mr. Whitman said gently, that the inheritance structure you were expecting may not reflect the actual terms of the estate. Marcus stood up abruptly. That's impossible. Dad and I went over the will together multiple times. He never mentioned changing anything. Nevertheless, a new will exists and takes precedence over all previous versions. I watched Marcus process this information, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the first flickerings of genuine concern. His lawyer was making rapid notes, probably calculating billable hours for what was about to become a much more complicated situation. I want to see it, Marcus said. Of course, Mr. Whitman opened his portfolio. However, I should mention that there are also several other parties who need to be present for the complete reading. Other parties? The new board members your father appointed to Thornton Construction. Marcus went very still. New board members? 3 individuals your father selected to provide oversight for the company's operations going forward. They should be arriving shortly. As if summoned by his words, the conference room door opened and Jim Martinez walked in. Jim was built like the foreman he'd been for 2 decades. Broad shoulders, calloused hands, and the kind of steady presence that came from solving problems on construction sites where mistakes could kill people. Behind Jim came Susan Walsh, the senior accountant who'd been with the company for 15 years. Susan was small and precise, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the methodical nature of someone who'd spent decades making sure numbers added up correctly. The third person to enter was David Shen, who nodded to me as he took a seat at the table. "What the hell is this?" Marcus demanded, his composure finally cracking. "These are the individuals your father appointed to serve on the board of directors for Thornton Construction," Mr. Whitman explained calmly. "Their presence is required for the full reading of the will." Marcus looked at Jim with barely concealed hostility. "Jim, what are you doing here?" Jim met his gaze steadily. "Your father asked me to serve on the board, said the company needed people who understood the work, not just the paperwork." "And you?" Marcus turned to Susan. "What's your involvement in this?" Susan's voice was quiet but firm. "Mr. Thornton asked me to prepare a financial analysis of the company's operations over the past 2 years. He wanted a complete picture of where things stood." "A financial analysis? I'm the one who handles the finances." "Yes," Susan said simply, "that's what the analysis was about." The implications of that statement hung in the air like smoke. Marcus's lawyer was scribbling furiously now, probably recognizing that his client was walking into something much bigger than a simple inheritance dispute. "Shall we proceed with the reading?" Mr. Whitman asked. Marcus sat down heavily, his jaw clenched. "Fine, let's get this over with." Mr. Whitman began reading the standard legal language that opened the will: property descriptions, tax identification numbers, the formal language of asset transfer. But everyone in the room was waiting for the substantive provisions, the part that would determine who got what. "To my son Marcus," Mr. Whitman read, "I leave my personal effects, including my watch collection, my tools, and my personal vehicle. I also leave him the family residence on Maple Street, along with all furnishings and personal property contained therein." Marcus nodded, apparently satisfied that at least some of his expectations were being met. "To my daughter Marjorie, I leave my photograph collection, my books, and my mother's jewelry." I felt a flutter of emotion remembering Grandma Thornton's cameo brooch, the one Dad had saved for me. Regarding Thornton Construction Company, including all business assets, properties, equipment, contracts, and intellectual property, Mr. Whitman continued, "I leave full ownership and control to my daughter Marjorie Thornton." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at the lawyer like he'd just announced that gravity had been repealed. "That can't be right," Marcus said finally. Mr. Whitman continued reading. "This decision is made after careful consideration of each of my children's qualifications and dedication to the company's mission. Marjorie has demonstrated a deep understanding of construction principles, project management, and the company's operational needs." "Understanding?" Marcus's voice rose. "She's a photographer. She lives in Portland. She hasn't been involved in the business for 20 years. Furthermore," Mr. Whitman read on, "I have observed concerning patterns in the company's recent financial performance and strategic direction. I believe new leadership is necessary to preserve the company's reputation and ensure its continued success." Marcus shot to his feet. "This is insane. Dad was sick, he was on medication. This isn't a legitimate document." "The will was executed during a period when Mr. Thornton was mentally competent," David Chen said calmly. "We have medical documentation to that effect, as well as video recordings of the signing ceremony where he clearly articulates his reasoning." "Video recordings?" "Your father was very thorough," David continued. "He wanted to ensure there would be no question about his mental state or the voluntariness of his decisions." Susan Walsh opened a folder she'd brought with her. "There's also the matter of the financial irregularities that have occurred over the past 2 years." Marcus whirled to face her. "What financial irregularities?" "Salary increases you authorized for yourself without board approval. Bonus payments tied to contract signatures rather than profitable completion. Vendor relationships that appear to favor companies where you have personal connections. Those are standard business practices." "No," Jim Martinez said quietly. "They're not. I've been in this business for 30 years. What you've been doing isn't standard anything. Susan continued, her voice steady and professional. The Riverside Medical Center project, for example. You underbid the contract by 32%, then attempted to make up the shortfall by substituting cheaper materials without informing the client. That's not. We have the invoices, Susan said simply, and the inspection reports, and the complaints from the medical center about structural deficiencies. Marcus's lawyer was making urgent notes, probably realizing that his client had walked into a thoroughly documented case of corporate mismanagement. The Patterson Elementary School renovation, Jim added. You promised completion in 8 weeks. We're now at 16 weeks and still not done, because you cut the crew size by 40% after signing the contract. And the Morrison office complex, Susan continued, where you charged premium rates for standard materials and pocketed the difference through a consulting agreement with your college roommate's firm. Each example hit Marcus like a physical blow. His face was growing redder, his breathing more labored. This is a setup, he said finally. You've all conspired against me. No, I said, speaking for the first time since the reading began. We've all been paying attention. Marcus turned his fury on me. You? You don't know anything about this business. You ran away to chase your little art dreams while I built this company into what it is today. What it is today, Jim said quietly, is a company that's lost 3 major clients in the past year because of missed deadlines and cost overruns. What it is today, Susan added, is a company whose profit margins have declined by 60%, while executive compensation has increased by 300%. What it is today, I said, looking directly at Marcus, is a company that Dad spent 50 years building and that you've spent 2 years destroying. Marcus slammed his hand on the table. I've modernized this company. I've brought in new clients, new contracts, new opportunities. You've brought in contracts we can't complete profitably, Jim corrected. You've brought in clients we can't satisfy. You've brought in opportunities that make us look incompetent. Mr. Whitman cleared his throat. There are additional provisions in the will that address the transition of leadership. Marcus collapsed back into his chair, looking like a man who'd just watched his life's work disappear before his eyes. Marjorie is required to actively manage the company for a minimum of 2 years, Mr. Whitman continued. During this period, she cannot sell or transfer ownership without unanimous approval from the board of directors. The board being these 3 people, Marcus gestured at Jim, Susan, and David. Plus Marjorie herself, David confirmed, a 4-person board with operational oversight. What about me? Marcus asked, his voice hollow. You remain a company employee with your current title and responsibilities, Mr. Whitman read. However, all major financial decisions require board approval going forward. Current title and responsibilities? I'm the president of this company. You're the vice president of business development, Susan corrected, consulting her notes. According to the corporate filings, you never actually held the title of president. Your father retained that position. Marcus stared at her in disbelief. That's just paperwork. Everyone knew I was running things. Everyone assumed you were running things, Jim said. Your father was still signing off on every major decision. We all saw the approval forms. But I thought. You thought what you wanted to think, I said quietly. Dad let you think it because he was hoping you'd figure out how to actually do the job, instead of just playing at it. Marcus looked around the table at faces that had once deferred to his authority, now looking back at him with something approaching pity. The will also provides for a comprehensive audit of company finances, Mr. Whitman continued, to ensure a complete understanding of the company's current position. An audit conducted by whom? Marcus's lawyer asked, finally finding his voice. An independent accounting firm selected by the board, David replied, with full access to all company records, including executive compensation, vendor relationships, and project profitability analyses. The lawyer whispered something urgent in Marcus's ear. Marcus shook his head, then stood up abruptly. This isn't over, he said, his voice tight with controlled rage. I'll contest this will. I'll prove Dad wasn't competent when he signed it. I'll show that Marjorie manipulated a sick old man into changing his estate plan. You're welcome to try, David said calmly, but I should mention that your father anticipated that possibility. He left very detailed documentation of his reasoning, including audio recordings of conversations with Marjorie that demonstrate her comprehensive understanding of the business operations. Audio recordings of conversations I wasn't included in, apparently. You were invited to participate in those conversations, I said, every time I visited. Every time Dad asked you to join us for dinner, or to stay and talk after the doctor's appointments. You always had somewhere more important to be. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. Not acceptance, exactly, but the beginning of recognition that his version of events might not be the only version. "This is going to destroy the company," he said finally. "You have no idea what you're getting into." "Maybe," I agreed, but Dad thought it was worth the risk. Marcus gathered his papers and stood to leave. His lawyer was already putting together what looked like the beginnings of a legal challenge. "I'll see you in court," Marcus said as he reached the door. "Probably," I replied, "but in the meantime, I'll see you at work on Monday morning." The door closed behind them with a sharp click, leaving me alone with my new board of directors and the enormity of what I'd just inherited. "Well," Jim said after a moment, "that went about as well as your father expected." He knew Marcus would react this way? He knew Marcus would fight, Susan said. But he also knew the numbers don't lie. When the audit is complete, there won't be much room for argument about why changes were necessary. I looked around the conference room at the 3 people Dad had chosen to help me rebuild what Marcus had damaged. It felt overwhelming and impossible, and exactly like the kind of challenge that would have made Dad smile. "So," I said, "where do we start?" Monday morning came faster than I'd expected. I stood in the parking lot of Thornton Construction at 7:30 a.m., watching pickup trucks and work vans arrive as the day shift began. The building itself was a testament to Dad's practical approach to business. Solid concrete block construction, functional rather than flashy, with the company logo etched into a granite slab by the front entrance. I'd spent the weekend in Dad's study, poring over financial records and project files, trying to absorb 20 years of business operations in 48 hours. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. Marcus hadn't just made bad decisions, he'd made consistently bad decisions, each one compounding the problems created by the last. Jim Martinez met me at the front door, coffee in hand and wearing the kind of expression that suggested he'd been thinking all weekend about what came next. "You ready for this?" he asked. "No," I said honestly, "but let's do it anyway." The main office buzzed with the usual Monday morning energy. Phones ringing, printers humming, the sound of people getting ready for another week of building things. But there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Word had gotten out about the will reading, and everyone was waiting to see what happened next. Marcus was already at his desk when we walked in, surrounded by boxes and looking like a man preparing for war. His computer screen showed what appeared to be legal documents, and his phone was pressed to his ear in what sounded like an urgent conversation with his attorney. "I don't care what the will says," he was saying as we passed. "There has to be a way to challenge this. Mental incompetency, undue influence, something." He looked up and saw me standing there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he ended his phone call and stood up. "Marjorie?" His voice was carefully controlled. "I assume you're here to discuss terms." "Terms?" "For backing out of this gracefully. Dad was sick, he wasn't thinking clearly. You know this company belongs with me. You know you're not qualified to run it." I walked over to his desk and looked at the boxes he'd been packing. Personal items, framed degrees, a few awards from industry associations. "Going somewhere?" "I'm protecting company assets," Marcus said, "making sure important documents don't disappear during the transition." "What transition would that be?" "The one where you realize you're in over your head and sign the company back to someone who actually knows how to run it." Jim stepped forward. "Marcus, maybe we should talk about what's actually going to happen here." "What's going to happen," Marcus said, his voice rising, "is that my sister is going to realize she's made a huge mistake and fix it before she destroys everything Dad built." "Everything Dad built is already being destroyed," Susan Walsh said, appearing in the doorway with a thick folder in her hands. "I finished the preliminary audit over the weekend." Marcus went pale. "What audit?" The one your father requested 6 weeks ago. The comprehensive review of company finances going back 2 years. Susan set the folder on Marcus's desk. Would you like to see the results? You had no authority to conduct an audit without my approval. I had your father's written authorization, Susan said calmly, and now I have board authorization. The audit is complete and the results are illuminating. She opened the folder and spread out several charts and graphs. Even from across the desk, I could see the trend lines were all pointing in the wrong direction. Company profits are down 63%, Susan read from her summary. Client retention is down 40%. Employee turnover up 200%. Meanwhile, executive compensation is up 350%. Those numbers are misleading, Marcus protested. You're not accounting for market fluctuations, competitive pressures. I'm accounting for everything, Susan interrupted, including the fact that our 3 biggest competitors have all seen profit increases during the same period we've been declining. She pulled out another chart. The Patterson Elementary project, originally bid at $200,000, extended to $430,000 due to cost overruns and delays. Net loss to the company, $180,000. That project had unforeseen complications. The complications were foreseen, Jim said quietly. I warned you about the foundation issues during the initial site survey. You told me to bid it anyway and figure it out later. Susan continued through the projects. Morrison Office Complex, Riverside Medical Center, the Springfield Community Center renovation. Each one a story of optimistic bidding followed by expensive reality. The Morrison project is particularly interesting, Susan said, pulling out a specific file. You subcontracted the electrical work to Pinnacle Solutions for $60,000. Pinnacle Solutions is owned by your college roommate Kevin Torres, who then subcontracted the actual work to Martinez Electric for $35,000. That's a standard markup. $25,000 for doing nothing but forwarding paperwork? That's not a markup, that's a kickback. Marcus looked around the room at faces that were no longer friendly, no longer deferential. These are all normal business practices. Every construction company operates this way. No, I said quietly, they don't. You don't know anything about this business. I know that Dad never operated this way. I know that Jim has been in construction for 30 years, and he's never seen practices like this. I know that Susan has been doing construction accounting for 15 years, and she's never seen financial irregularities on this scale. Marcus slammed his hand on the desk. So what's your plan? Fire me? Destroy the company out of spite? My plan, I said, is to save the company, starting with stopping the bleeding. I pulled out a document I'd prepared over the weekend. Effective immediately, all contracts require board approval before signing. All expenditures over $5,000 require board approval. All vendor relationships require disclosure of any personal connections. You can't micromanage every decision. I'm not micromanaging. I'm instituting basic oversight that should have been in place all along. Susan pulled out another file. There's also the matter of the Meridian construction offer. Marcus froze. What about it? The preliminary purchase agreement you signed. The one where you agreed to sell the company for 40% below market value in exchange for a personal management contract worth $2 million over 5 years. How did you? Your father found the documents in your desk, Susan said simply. He was looking for the Patterson project files and found your secret negotiation folder instead. The room went completely silent. Marcus looked like a man watching his life collapse in real time. I was exploring options, he said weakly. Due diligence. Dad was sick, I was planning for contingencies. You were planning to sell Dad's company while he was dying, I said, without telling him, without telling the board. For a fraction of what it's worth. The company isn't worth anything if it can't be run properly. Then maybe the problem isn't the company, Jim said quietly. Marcus looked around the room one more time, then started shoving items from his desk into the boxes with violent efficiency. Fine, he said. You want to run this company into the ground? Go ahead. But when it all falls apart, don't come crying to me to fix it. We won't, I said. He stopped packing and stared at me. You really think you can do this? You really think you can walk in here and fix 20 years of business relationships overnight? I think I can stop making them worse. Marcus finished packing his personal items and stood up, I'll be back, he said, with lawyers, with accountants, with evidence that Dad wasn't competent when he signed that will. You're welcome to try, David Chen said, appearing in the doorway. But you should know that your father recorded a video statement explaining his reasoning. Very detailed. Very clear about his mental state and his concerns about the company's direction. A video statement? 37 minutes of him explaining exactly why he was changing his will and what he hoped you would learn from the experience. David handed Marcus a business card. Your attorney can contact me to arrange a viewing. Marcus took the card with shaking hands. This isn't over. No, I agreed, it's not. But your part in running this company is. Marcus walked out of the office carrying his boxes, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until we heard the front door slam behind him. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of phones ringing and the normal business of the day continuing around us. But everything had changed. So, Jim said after a moment, what's the first order of business, boss? The word hit me like a physical blow. Boss? I was the boss of a construction company I'd inherited 3 days ago from a father who'd been planning this transition for months, while I thought I was just being a supportive daughter. First, I said, we need to call an all-hands meeting. Everyone needs to know what's happening and what it means for their jobs. Good idea, Susan agreed. There are a lot of rumors flying around. Second, we need to review every active contract and assess our actual financial obligations versus our projected income. I can have that ready by this afternoon, Susan said. Third, we need to talk to our clients. The ones Marcus hasn't already alienated need to know the company is under new management and we're committed to delivering what we promised. I can handle the client calls, Jim offered. Most of them know me anyway. And fourth, I said, taking a deep breath, we need to figure out if this company can actually be saved or if Dad left me a sinking ship. Susan and Jim exchanged glances. It can be saved, Susan said quietly. The fundamentals are still sound. Good equipment, experienced crews, solid reputation in the community. The problems are all management-related. Which means they can be fixed, Jim added. It's going to take time, and it's going to take some tough decisions, but it can be done. I walked over to the window that overlooked the equipment yard. Concrete mixers, excavators, bulldozers, all the machinery Dad had bought over the years to build his vision of what a construction company should be. Everything was there. Everything except the leadership to use it properly. All right, I said, turning back to face my new team. Let's get to work. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for 11 a.m. in the main conference room. By 10:30, word had spread through the building, and crews were coming in from job sites to hear what the new boss had to say. I'd spent the morning reviewing personnel files, trying to put names to faces and understand the human cost of Marcus's mismanagement. Veteran employees leaving for competitors. Young workers burning out from impossible deadlines. A skilled workforce being systematically demoralized by bad leadership. When I walked into the conference room, 37 people were waiting for me. Foremen and equipment operators, office staff and project managers, people who'd worked for Dad since the early days, and newer employees who'd joined during Marcus's tenure. All of them looked uncertain about what came next. I know there are a lot of questions about what's happening with the company, I began. I want to answer those questions honestly. I explained the will, the board changes, Marcus's departure. I outlined the financial problems we were facing and the steps we'd be taking to address them. Most importantly, I promised that there would be no layoffs during the transition period. I know most of you don't know me, I said. You know I'm Tom's daughter, and you probably know I've been living in Portland working as a photographer. What you might not know is that I spend every summer from age 12 to 18 working on Dad's job sites. I know how concrete sets and how steel bends and how important it is to have a foundation you can trust. A few nods from the older workers who remembered those summer days. I also know this company has lost its way. We've been bidding jobs we can't complete profitably, making promises we can't keep, and forgetting that our reputation is our most valuable asset. More nods, more signs of recognition. Starting today, we're going back to basics. We're going to bid for jobs we can win and complete on time. We're going to charge fair prices for quality work. We're going to treat our employees, our clients, and our subcontractors with the respect they deserve. A hand went up in the back. Tommy Rodriguez, one of the crane operators. What about the contracts we've already signed, he asked. Some of those jobs are barely breaking even. We're gonna honor every contract, I said, even the ones that lose money. Because that's what Dad would have done, and that's what it means to run an honorable business. Another hand, Maria Santos from the accounting department. What about the Meridian buyout offer? Are we still considering that? There is no buyout offer, I said firmly. This company is not for sale. Not now, not ever. The meeting continued for another hour. Questions about project timelines, vendor relationships, expansion plans. Good questions from people who cared about the company's future and wanted to understand their role in it. When it was over, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope. These were good people doing important work. They deserved better leadership than Marcus had provided, and they were willing to give me a chance to provide it. The real test would come in the weeks ahead, when we had to prove that new leadership could translate into better results. But for the first time since inheriting the company, I believed it was possible. Dad had built something worth saving. Now it was up to me to figure out how to save it. 3 weeks after taking control of Thornton Construction, I was sitting in Judge Patricia Hawkins' courtroom, watching Marcus's attorney present his case for why I should be removed as company president, and the will should be declared invalid. Your Honor, Attorney Bradley Fitzgerald said, pacing in front of the bench with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a case he thought he should win. Thomas Thornton was a sick man in his final months. He was on powerful pain medications, undergoing chemotherapy, and clearly not in a mental state to make rational decisions about his life's work. I sat at the defendant's table with David Chen, surrounded by boxes of evidence that told a very different story. Behind us, the courtroom was packed with Thornton Construction employees, suppliers, and clients who'd come to witness what Marcus had promised would be his vindication. Furthermore, Fitzgerald continued, the beneficiary of this suspicious will change had unprecedented access to Mr. Thornton during his illness. She flew in from Portland repeatedly, spent hours alone with him, and clearly used his vulnerable state to manipulate him into disinheriting his qualified son in favor of someone with no relevant business experience. Judge Hawkins looked unimpressed. Mr. Fitzgerald, do you have evidence of this alleged manipulation? We have evidence that Marjorie Thornton spent an unusual amount of time with her father in his final months, far more than her previous pattern of contact would suggest. Evidence that a daughter cared for her dying father? That's your proof of manipulation? Fitzgerald's confidence wavered slightly. Your Honor, the drastic change in the will, combined with the timing of these visits, suggests undue influence. What I'm looking for, Judge Hawkins said sharply, is actual evidence, not speculation. David Chen stood up. Your Honor, if I may respond to opposing counsel's allegations? Please do. David walked to the center of the courtroom carrying a laptop computer. Mr. Fitzgerald claims that Thomas Thornton was not mentally competent when he executed his final will. I'd like to show the court a video recording made the same day the will was signed. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd refused to watch the video when David had offered to show it to him the week before. The courtroom's video system flickered to life, and suddenly Dad was there on the screen, sitting in his study, looking directly into the camera with the kind of sharp focus that made it clear his mind was completely present. My name is Thomas Michael Thornton, he said in a voice that was weak but steady. Today is October 15th, and I'm recording this statement to accompany my final will and testament, which I signed this morning in the presence of my attorney David Chen and 2 witnesses. The camera showed the date and timestamp clearly. Dad continued speaking, his words measured and deliberate. I know that my decision to leave Thornton Construction to my daughter Marjorie instead of my son Marcus will come as a surprise to some people. I want to explain my reasoning while I'm still able to do so clearly. Marcus's face was stone as he watched his father speak from beyond the grave. For the past 2 years, I've watched Marcus run my company into the ground. Not through malice, but through arrogance and inexperience. He's more interested in appearing successful than in actually being successful. He's more concerned with his own compensation than with the company's health. Dad pulled out a file folder and opened it on his desk. The Patterson Elementary project was bid at $200,000. Marcus assured me it would be profitable. The final cost was $430,000. We lost $180,000 on a job that should have made us $50,000. He turned to another page. The Morrison office complex. Marcus arranged for electrical work to be subcontracted to a company owned by his college friend for $60,000. That same company then subcontracted the actual work to our regular electrician for $35,000. $25,000 vanished for no reason except to enrich Marcus's friend. The courtroom was completely silent. Even Fitzgerald had stopped taking notes. The Riverside Medical Center project. Marcus cut corners on materials to increase profit margins. The result was structural deficiencies that had to be corrected at our expense. Cost overruns, $240,000. Dad looked directly into the camera. I've tried to talk to Marcus about these problems. He tells me I don't understand modern business practices. He tells me I'm old-fashioned. He tells me everything is under control. He held up another document. This is a preliminary purchase agreement Marcus signed with Meridian Construction. He agreed to sell my company for $12 million. The company is worth at least $20 million. In exchange for accepting this below-market offer, Marcus negotiated a personal management contract worth $2 million over 5 years. The camera captured Dad's expression perfectly. Disappointment mixed with determination. Marcus was planning to sell my life's work for less than it's worth and pocket a fortune for himself. He never discussed this with me. He never asked for my approval. He just assumed that because I was sick, I wouldn't find out. Dad closed the folder and looked directly at the camera again. Marjorie, on the other hand, has spent the past 8 months learning about the business. Not because she wanted to inherit it, but because she wanted to help me understand what was going wrong. She's asked better questions about construction operations in 6 months than Marcus has asked in 6 years. He pulled out a small audio recorder. I've recorded many of our conversations. With her permission, of course. I want people to understand that she's not just an artist from Portland. She's someone who learned construction from the ground up, someone who understands that you can't build a reputation on shortcuts and deception. The video showed Dad pressing play on the recorder. My voice filled the courtroom, discussing foundation specifications for the community center project. The soil composition reports show clay content at 18%, my recorded voice said. That's going to require deeper pilings than Marcus budgeted for. If we don't account for that now, we'll have settling problems within 2 years. Dad's voice responded, How did you know to check the soil reports? Because that's what you taught me when I was 16. You said the foundation is everything. Get that wrong and nothing else matters. Dad stopped the recording and looked back at the camera. Marcus never learned to check soil reports. He delegates everything to subordinates, and then blames them when things go wrong. Marjorie learned to check soil reports when she was a teenager, because she understood that details matter. The video continued for another 20 minutes. Dad methodically laid out his reasoning, his concerns about the company's direction, and his confidence in my ability to fix the problems Marcus had created. I am not being manipulated, he said firmly. I am not mentally incompetent. I am not making emotional decisions. I am making a rational business decision based on 2 years of evidence that Marcus is destroying everything I built. He looked directly into the camera one final time. This is my company. I built it from nothing. I have the right to leave it to whoever I think can preserve what I created and restore what's been damaged. That person is Marjorie. The video ended, and the courtroom remained silent for a long moment. Judge Hawkins made a note on her pad, then looked up at Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald, would you like to present any evidence that contradicts what we just heard? Fitzgerald stood up slowly. Your Honor, while Mr. Thornton appears lucid in that recording, we maintain that his judgment was impaired by his illness and by his daughter's influence. Do you have any evidence of impaired judgment beyond your client's disappointment about the inheritance? We have evidence that the company has suffered significant financial losses under Marcus Thornton's leadership, but we contend that these were due to market conditions, not mismanagement. David Chen stood up. Your Honor, I'd like to call Susan Walsh to testify about the company's financial performance compared to industry standards. Susan walked to the witness stand with the calm confidence of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. She was sworn in and took her seat. Ms. Walsh, David said, you've been the senior accountant at Thornton Construction for 15 years. Have you conducted an analysis of the company's financial performance over the past 2 years? Yes, I have. What did you find? Susan pulled out a chart and showed it to the court. Company profits declined 63%, while our three main competitors saw profit increases averaging 22% during the same period. What accounts for this disparity? Poor project management, unrealistic bidding, and excessive executive compensation. Marcus Thornton paid himself more than the presidents of companies, twice our size, while delivering results that were consistently below industry standards. Fitzgerald objected. Hearsay, Your Honor. Sustained. Ms. Walsh, please limit your testimony to financial facts, not conclusions about management. Susan nodded. The facts are these. Over the past 2 years, Thornton Construction completed 37 projects. 23 of them lost money. The average loss per project was $87,000. And how does this compare to the company's historical performance? In the previous 2 years under Thomas Thornton's direct supervision, we completed 41 projects. 38 were profitable. The average profit per project was $62,000. The numbers hung in the air like an indictment. Marcus's face was red with embarrassment and anger. Pytor. Ms. Walsh, David continued, are you aware of any changes in market conditions that would account for this dramatic difference in performance? No. If anything, market conditions have been favorable. Construction demand has been strong, and material costs have been stable. Thank you. No further questions. Fitzgerald approached the witness stand. Ms. Walsh, isn't it true that you've been passed over for promotion several times during Marcus Thornton's tenure? I've been in the same position for 15 years, yes. And isn't it true that you resent Marcus Thornton's success? I resent the company's failure, Susan said quietly. I resent watching good people lose their jobs because of bad decisions. But you personally benefited from Thomas Thornton's will change, didn't you? You were appointed to the board of directors. I was appointed to help fix the problems I've been documenting for 2 years. Problems that Marcus Thornton disputes? Marcus Thornton can dispute gravity if he wants to. That doesn't mean things will stop falling. A few people in the courtroom chuckled. Judge Hawkins suppressed a smile. No further questions, Fitzgerald said tersely. David called Jim Martinez next. Jim's testimony was straightforward and devastating. Project after project, where Marcus had made promises that couldn't be kept, cut corners that created safety hazards, and blamed field supervisors for problems that started in the executive office. The Patterson Elementary job, Jim said. Marcus promised we'd have it done in 8 weeks. I told him it would take 12 weeks minimum. He said we'd figure it out. We're now at 18 weeks and still not finished. What caused the delays? Inadequate crew scheduling, substandard materials, and unrealistic deadlines. Everything I warned him about during the planning phase. Did Marcus accept responsibility for these problems? Marcus blamed me for not working fast enough. He blamed the crew for not working hard enough. He blamed the school district for changing requirements. He blamed everyone except the person who made the bad decisions in the first place. By the time Jim finished testifying, Marcus looked like a man who'd been run over by one of his own bulldozers. Judge Hawkins called for a recess, and I found myself standing in the courthouse hallway watching Marcus pace back and forth like a caged animal. This is insane, he was saying to his attorney. They're making me look like some kind of criminal. You're not a criminal, Fitzgerald replied. But you're also not making a very good case for why you should be running the company. I graduated from business school. I have an MBA. She's a photographer. She's a photographer who apparently learned more about construction in 8 months than you learned in 8 years. Marcus stopped pacing and stared at his lawyer. Are you giving up on me? I'm being realistic. Your father's video testimony is devastating. The financial records support everything he said. The employee testimony corroborates the operational problems. What exactly do you want me to argue? Argue that I deserve what's mine. What's yours is what your father chose to leave you, a house, a car, and personal effects. The company was never yours. It was always his to dispose of as he saw fit. Marcus slumped against the wall. So that's it? I just lose everything? You lose a job you weren't performing well. That's not the same as losing everything. When court reconvened, Judge Hawkins had clearly made up her mind. I've reviewed the evidence presented by both parties, she said. Mr. Fitzgerald, your client has failed to demonstrate that Thomas Thornton was mentally incompetent when he executed his final will. The video testimony clearly shows a man of sound mind making rational decisions based on documented evidence. Marcus closed his eyes. Furthermore, the financial records and employee testimony support Mr. Thornton's assessment of his son's performance as company president. The will change appears to be based on legitimate business concerns, not manipulation or undue influence. Judge Hawkins looked directly at Marcus. Mr. Thornton, your father left you a substantial inheritance, a house, personal property, and financial assets. What he didn't leave you was a business that you demonstrated you couldn't run successfully. That was his choice to make. She turned to me. Ms. Thornton, you've inherited not just a company, but a responsibility to the employees, clients, and community that depend on that company. I trust you understand the weight of that responsibility. I do, Your Honor. Then this court finds that Thomas Thornton's final will is valid and binding. The inheritance stands as written. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. Marcus sat motionless as people began filing out around him. I walked over to where he was sitting. Marcus, I said quietly. He looked up at me with eyes that were red with exhaustion and defeat. I'm sorry it came to this, I said. No, you're not. I'm sorry Dad felt like he had to choose between his children. I'm sorry you couldn't see what was happening to the company. I'm sorry we couldn't find a way to work together. Marcus stood up slowly. What happens now? Now we both try to build something better than what we inherited. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded once and walked away. I stood in the empty courtroom, holding the weight of Dad's legacy and the responsibility of hundreds of people's livelihoods. The legal fight was over, but the real work was just beginning. Outside the courthouse, Jim and Susan were waiting for me. How does it feel to win? Jim asked. Like losing, I said, but like losing something we needed to lose. What's next? Next, we go back to work. We have a company to save. 6 months after the court ruling, I stood in the same conference room where Marcus had once declared that I would get nothing, looking at a quarterly profit report that told a very different story. Thornton Construction was not just surviving, it was thriving. We're up 47% from last quarter, Susan announced to the board meeting, her voice carrying a satisfaction that came from watching careful planning pay off. Client retention is at 93%, and we have a 6-month backlog of projects. Jim Martinez smiled from across the table. The crews are happy. Nobody's working crazy overtime anymore, and we're actually finishing projects ahead of schedule. What about the Patterson Elementary job, I asked. The one that was supposed to be done in 8 weeks? Finished last Tuesday, Jim said. Final inspection passed with 0 deficiencies. The principal sent a thank you note saying it was the smoothest construction project the school district had ever experienced. The transformation hadn't been easy. Those first few months after taking control had been a constant battle against the damage Marcus had inflicted. Disgruntled clients, demoralized employees, suppliers who'd been burned by broken promises and late payments. But we'd addressed each problem systematically. Honest conversations with clients about realistic timelines. Fair compensation for employees who'd been underpaid. Prompt payments to suppliers who'd been kept waiting for months. The Springfield Community Center project starts next month, Susan continued. That's a $2 million contract, and we're bidding it at a sustainable profit margin. What's a sustainable profit margin? I asked, still learning the vocabulary of business success. 22%, Susan said with a grin. Marcus used to bid at 8% and hope for the best. We're bidding at 22% and delivering exactly what we promise. The irony wasn't lost on me. By charging more, we were actually making clients happier. By setting realistic deadlines, we were building a reputation for reliability. By paying employees fairly, we were attracting better talent. Any word from Marcus? David Chen asked. He's working for Meridian Construction now, Susan said. Same company he was planning to sell us to. They hired him as a project manager. How's that working out? About as well as you'd expect. I heard they had to fire him from the hospital renovation project after he promised completion in 6 months for a job that needed 12. I felt a pang of sadness at that news. Marcus was my brother, and despite everything that had happened, I didn't want to see him fail. But I also understood that some people had to learn lessons the hard way. Speaking of the hospital, Jim said, they've asked us to bid on the new emergency wing addition. It's a $15 million project. $15 million? I sat up straighter. That's bigger than anything we've ever done. It's bigger than anything we've ever done successfully, Susan corrected. Marcus bid on projects that size all the time, he just couldn't deliver them. What do you think? I asked Jim. Are we ready for something like that? We're ready, Jim said confidently. We've got the crew, we've got the equipment, and we've got the track record now. The hospital board knows we can be trusted to do what we say we'll do. Trust. It was a currency Marcus had never understood. He'd thought business was about making deals, signing contracts, and finding shortcuts. But real business was about trust with clients, employees, suppliers, and the community. All right, I said. Prepare the bid, but do it right. I want detailed timelines, realistic costs, and a buffer for unexpected complications. You got it. The meeting continued for another hour, covering equipment maintenance, employee benefits, and expansion plans. Normal business topics that felt extraordinary because they were being discussed by people who actually cared about the company's long-term success. After the board meeting, I walked through the office, checking in with employees and getting updates on active projects. The atmosphere was completely different from those first chaotic days. People smiled when they saw me. They brought me problems because they knew I'd help solve them, not because they were afraid of being blamed. Miss Thornton? Maria Santos from accounting approached my desk. I've got the monthly reports ready for your review. Thank you, Maria. How are things looking? Good. Really good. We've got positive cash flow, all our accounts receivable are current, and we've built up a healthy reserve fund for the first time in years. A reserve fund? Money set aside for unexpected expenses. Your father always maintained one, but it disappeared during Marcus's tenure. We're back to having 6 months of operating expenses in reserve. That's Dad's influence? That's your influence. You insisted on conservative financial management, and it's paying off. I reviewed the reports at my desk, marveling at how different the numbers looked when a company was run by people who understood the difference between short-term profits and long-term sustainability. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Can we talk, Marcus? I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, when and where? Coffee shop on Main Street, 1 hour. I found Marcus sitting at a corner table, looking older than his 42 years. He'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Thank you for coming, he said as I sat down across from him. How are you, Marcus? I've been better. He stirred sugar into his coffee with the mechanical motion of someone buying time. I heard the company's doing well. We're getting there. The hospital project, that's a big deal. It could be. Dad would be proud. I studied my brother's face, looking for signs of the anger and resentment that had defined our relationship for so many months. Instead, I saw something I hadn't expected: acceptance. Marcus, why did you want to meet? Because I owe you an apology. I waited. I was wrong about everything. About the company, about Dad's decision, about your ability to run the business. I was so focused on what I thought I deserved that I never stopped to ask whether I was actually earning it. What happened at Meridian? Marcus laughed bitterly. They fired me. 3rd job I've been fired from since the court ruling. Turns out my reputation preceded me. I'm sorry. Don't be. I earned it. He looked directly at me for the first time. I ruined Dad's company because I was too arrogant to admit I didn't know what I was doing. You saved it because you were smart enough to listen to people who did. You could have listened too. I could have. But I was too busy trying to prove I was smarter than everyone else. He pulled out an envelope and set it on the table. This is a formal resignation from any claim to Thornton Construction. I'm signing away any potential legal challenge to Dad's will. I opened the envelope and found a notarized document relinquishing any future claims to the company or its assets. You don't have to do this, I said. Yeah, I do. Because Dad was right. The company doesn't belong to me. It never did. It belongs to the people who understand what it takes to build something that lasts. We sat in silence for a few minutes, drinking coffee and processing 6 months of conflict that was finally coming to an end. What will you do now? I asked. Start over. Find something I'm actually good at, maybe learn some humility along the way. The offer still stands, you know. If you want to come back and work for the company. Not as president, but as an employee. Someone who could learn the business from the ground up. Marcus smiled sadly. I appreciate that. But I think it's better for everyone if I make my own way. Besides, you don't need me. You've got Jim and Susan and a whole crew of people who know what they're doing. They're good people. They're Dad's people, and now they're your people. That's how it should be. We finished our coffee and walked outside into the late afternoon sunlight. The Springfield skyline was visible in the distance, dotted with buildings that bore Dad's signature. Marjorie, Marcus said as we reached our cars. Yeah? Build something good, something Dad would be proud of. I will. And don't let success go to your head the way I did. I won't. He got in his car and drove away, leaving me standing in the parking lot with the weight of his apology and the lightness of genuine reconciliation. That evening, I drove to the cemetery where Dad was buried. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across the headstones. I knelt beside Dad's grave and placed a single white rose on the marble marker. We did it, Dad, I whispered. We saved the company. The wind rustled through the oak trees, and for a moment I could almost hear his voice. I knew you would. I pulled out my phone and called Jim Martinez. Hey, boss, he answered. What's up? I want to establish a scholarship program. The Thomas Thornton Construction Scholarship, for kids who want to learn the building trades. That's a great idea. What brought that on? Dad always said the most important thing we build is the next generation. I think it's time we started building that too. I'll get Susan to work up the numbers. How much are we talking about? Enough to matter, enough to change some lives. You got it. I hung up and sat on the bench beside Dad's grave, watching the last light fade from the sky. In 6 months, I'd inherited a company, saved it from bankruptcy, reconciled with my brother, and found a purpose I'd never expected. The quiet daughter who'd been written off as unimportant had become the leader of a company that employed 50 people and contributed millions of dollars to the local economy. The artist who'd supposedly chosen dreams over reality had discovered that building something real was the most satisfying creative work she'd ever done. I thought about Marcus's words at the coffee shop, build something good, something Dad would be proud of. I intended to do exactly that. The next morning, I was back at the office by 7 a.m., reviewing the hospital project proposal with Jim and Susan. We had a bid to prepare, contracts to negotiate, and a company to run. The emergency wing needs to be completed in 14 months, Jim said, studying the architectural drawings. That's tight, but doable if we plan it right. What would Marcus have promised? I asked. 10 months, Susan said immediately. Then he would have blamed everyone else when it took 18. So we promise 14 months and deliver in 13? Now you're thinking like a contractor, Jim said with a grin. I looked around the conference room at the faces of people who'd trusted me with their livelihoods and their professional reputations. Good people doing important work, building things that would last long after we were all gone. All right, I said, let's build something extraordinary. Outside the window, I could see the Springfield skyline, dotted with buildings that bore Dad's signature. Soon, there would be one more, and after that, maybe another. And another. Building something that lasts, one project at a time. The funeral was over, the will had been read, the battle had been won. Now the real work could begin. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you, right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.